He was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body. He was crucified, and nobody dies for a lie.
1 year, one film, and a mystery Hollywood has spent years avoiding. Mel Gibson has returned, and this time he's completing the journey he began decades ago. But before the resurrection of Christ reaches theaters, there's another story you need to hear first. Not the one captured on camera, but the one that unfolded behind it. Actors struck by lightning. Injuries no one could explain. A presence on set that seemed impossible to describe. For nearly 20 years, these stories remained hidden. Now they're finally coming to light, because what happened during the making of The Passion of the Christ may be one of the most extraordinary stories in cinema history. And now, bringing everything back to where it began, Gibson has returned to the very place that started it all. 20 years later, in Matera, southern Italy. The same town where Christ's crucifixion was filmed will now become the setting where his resurrection is brought to life. Matera is known for its homes and winding passageways carved directly into stone. Many locals refer to it as the City of the Dead because countless ancient cave dwellings dating back to the Paleolithic era originally served as burial sites. That history was exactly what drew Gibson there. He wanted a tomb that felt real, cut from solid rock, a place where the presence of death seemed authentic. But not long after filming began, strange events started unfolding. An uneasy feeling settled over the set. No one could explain it, yet everyone seemed to sense it. The weather in Matera, normally steady and predictable, suddenly became erratic. Calm, sunny mornings could transform into dark, swirling skies within moments. Filming would begin beneath bright blue skies, only for powerful winds to appear without warning, tearing tents from the ground and knocking over heavy lighting rigs. What made it even more unsettling was that these sudden storms seemed to hover only above the film set while everything around it remained perfectly calm. The crew grew more uneasy by the day. Some of the more superstitious Italian technicians quietly wondered if disturbing ancient graves had brought punishment upon them. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a bright, cloudless afternoon. The crew was preparing one of the film's most inspiring scenes, the Sermon on the Mount. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth as Jim Caviezel, portraying Christ, made his way up the hillside while crew members checked cameras and sound equipment. Then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. Heavy storm clouds gathered directly above Caviezel within seconds. He later recalled feeling a chill race down his spine as though something was about to happen. Moments later, lightning split the sky and struck him directly. The force surged through his entire body. The crack was deafening. Every camera immediately shut off. Crew members cried out, and for a brief instant, the entire set fell into complete silence. Watching from a distance, Gibson later described the sight as something lifted straight from Scripture. The actor portraying Jesus surrounded by blinding light, his hair standing upright like a halo of static electricity. Somehow, Caviezel never fell. He survived. Assistant director Jan Michelini rushed up the hill toward him, and the moment he arrived, a second lightning strike hit the exact same location. 2 strikes. 1 spot. Less than a minute apart. Both men were knocked to the ground by the impact. Everyone else stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. By all accounts, it seemed impossible. When paramedics arrived expecting the worst, they found both men alive, without severe burns or visible injuries, only shaken, their clothing slightly scorched, and the sharp scent of ozone lingering in the air. Even the medics admitted they had never seen anyone survive a lightning strike like that. From that day forward, everything on set felt different. No one openly discussed it, yet whispers spread everywhere. Was it simply coincidence? Some believed it was a warning. Others saw it as a blessing. Whatever the explanation, everyone agreed filming never felt the same again. Every morning started with prayer. Crew members who had never been to church found themselves making the sign of the cross before the cameras rolled. At sunrise, the entire team gathered together to pray before beginning the day's work. Even the weather seemed to mirror the story itself, darkening during scenes of suffering and clearing whenever scenes of forgiveness were filmed. Rumors quickly spread that Caviezel seemed destined for the role. His initials were the same as Jesus Christ's, JC, and he was 33 years old when production began, the same age many scholars believe Jesus was at the time of his crucifixion. But playing the part demanded far more from him than he ever imagined. While filming the scourging sequence, Gibson wanted every moment to feel painfully authentic. He wanted audiences to experience the full brutality of suffering. To protect Caviezel, the crew placed a thick wooden shield behind his back, hidden from the camera. But during one take, a strike went off target. An actor portraying a Roman soldier swung the whip with too much force, and the metal tip sliced through the protection and into Caviezel's back. The scream heard in the finished film wasn't acting, it was genuine agony. Caviezel later recalled, "I couldn't breathe. The pain sent my body into shock. I thought it would happen only once, but then it happened again." A second misplaced lash reopened the injury, leaving a wound more than a foot long. The scar remains with him to this day, and that footage stayed in the final cut, becoming one of the film's most unforgettable scenes. But his ordeal was far from over. Next came the filming of The Way of the Cross. Gibson insisted on using a real wooden cross, solid, massive, and weighing more than 150 pounds. Caviezel had to carry it through the heat, collapse beneath its weight, then rise and continue over and over again. During one take, an actor playing a Roman soldier was supposed to catch the crossbeam before it struck him. He missed. The full weight of the cross crashed directly onto Caviezel's head. "It felt like my head split open like a melon," he later said. "Some of the blood you see on screen was fake. Some of it belonged to me. The injuries didn't end there. The impact also dislocated his shoulder, leaving him in unbearable pain." Crew members rushed over to help, but Caviezel refused to stop filming. He wanted the audience to see that fall exactly as it happened, hoping they might feel, even for a moment, the crushing weight Christ carried. Gibson agreed and kept the cameras rolling. For several more minutes, Caviezel continued forward with his shoulder completely out of place. Nothing about those moments was performed. Not the contorted expression, not the tears, and not the groans of pain. When the take finally ended, doctors confirmed the dislocation and told him to take a few days off. He refused and was back filming the very next day, his arm still swollen and numb. Gibson later admitted that scene was never redone. So every time that moment plays, the cross crashing down on Jesus, you're not watching acting. You're watching exactly what happened. By that point, the line separating the performance from reality had essentially disappeared. Caviezel's physical suffering had merged with the spiritual weight of the story he was telling. This wasn't just a film anymore, it had turned into something closer to penance. From there, Caviezel's body started breaking down. Filming pushed forward, but the cold got worse and worse. The crucifixion scenes, Christ suspended on Calvary between earth and sky, were shot during the brutal Italian winter in Matera, with temperatures barely above freezing. He spent hours motionless on the cross, wearing almost nothing, soaked by rain and cut by icy wind. Between takes, crew wrapped him in blankets and brought out heaters, but nothing helped much. His core temperature kept dropping. Medics eventually confirmed hypothermia. His lips had gone purple, his hands were shaking, his breathing had grown shallow. Any reasonable production would have stopped filming. Caviezel wouldn't allow it. "Christ didn't come down off the cross," he said. "Neither will I." The days that followed tested his endurance to the limit. The cold and physical toll eventually led to double pneumonia, and his exhausted body could barely keep going. He kept losing weight. The labored, gasping breaths heard in the film's closing scenes aren't sound design or acting, that's a man's lungs genuinely giving out in real time. Fiction and reality had blurred together in a way that was almost frightening. On top of everything, there was the makeup. Every day started with 8 to 10 hours in the chair applying fake wounds and blood. To save time, Caviezel started sleeping in it. That decision came at a cost. The cold and the chemicals cracked his skin, the adhesive triggered allergic reactions and sores, and reused prosthetics led to blisters and infections. At a certain point, real wounds and fake ones became almost impossible to tell apart, even for the makeup team. There were no stunt doubles and no special effects standing in for the pain. It was all genuine, and the cameras captured every bit of it. Worried crew members pleaded with Gibson to shut production down for Caviezel's sake. His response was steady. If he can take it, so can we. Both men understood exactly what they were doing. They weren't after spectacle. They were chasing a kind of truth that could only come through real sacrifice. If you freeze the film during the crucifixion, you'll notice something strange. The hands holding the hammer and driving in the nails aren't a Roman actors. They belong to Gibson himself. He later explained that choice. He wanted to show that it was his own sins, and by extension everyone's sins that put Christ on that cross. While filming the crucifixion, Gibson kept the cameras running even as Caviezel began shaking from the cold. Nothing was cut away from or softened. To Gibson, editing around the suffering would have betrayed the emotional truth of the scene. Suffering that's been trimmed down, in his mind, isn't honest suffering anymore. Feverish and with his shoulder still bandaged, Caviezel pushed through every take. After all of it, the lightning, the whipping, the dislocated shoulder, the hypothermia, the mood on set changed into something harder to define. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't just exhaustion. It felt like a presence, a strange sensation, as though every stone and shadow and gust of wind was somehow aware. No one could explain it, but no one could shake it off either. During the heaviest scenes, a silence would settle over the set, unlike anything the crew had experienced before. No coughing, no whispering, just wind. And now and then someone quietly crying. Several crew members later admitted they couldn't tell where the acting stopped and something more personal began. Some cast members slipped away between takes to cry alone. Others found themselves praying without really knowing why. Gibson himself was spotted more than once walking away from the set with red eyes, mouthing prayers. Even the exhausted makeup team said they felt an odd sense of calm underneath all the chaos. And some crew members claimed the cameras caught flashes of light that had no source in the rigging, brief flickers that appeared and vanished with no technical explanation. The head camera operator swore that while filming Caviezel's face on the cross, he saw a bright, white shape move behind him and then disappear. When they checked the footage afterward, there was nothing there. Rumors spread among the assistants and technicians about men dressed in white seen moving between the cameras, quietly suggesting where to place a light or how to frame a shot. They spoke calmly, with an odd sense of authority and a steady, deliberate gaze. They'd offer precise direction, then vanish. Nobody could figure out who they were. They weren't on any crew list. Nobody had hired them. Yet everyone who ran into them described the exact same thing. By the time filming wrapped, the story had practically become legend. Several crew members said that when they went back through set photos, those men never appeared in a single frame, not in photos. Not in behind-the-scenes footage, not even on the studio's own security cameras. Gibson later said, "There were things that can't be explained, but everything unfolded the way it was supposed to." The atmosphere became so intense that for many crew members, the shoot started to feel like a spiritual retreat. Some extras who'd only signed up as background players ended up asking to go to confession or get baptized before the film wrapped. A handful of lead actors converted during production. One was Luca Leonello, who played Judas. Before filming, he described himself as an atheist and was fairly dismissive of faith. But after weeks on set, he said he'd become a Christian. And once filming ended, he and his family were received into the Catholic Church and baptized. In his own words, "I didn't believe in God. I signed on to play a role in the Passion, but afterward I couldn't stop thinking about who Jesus really was. Playing Judas somehow taught me about God's forgiveness. That film changed my life. I found my faith and was baptized." He wasn't alone. Pietro Cerubi played Barabbas, the criminal set free instead of Jesus, a small part with barely any lines but heavy with meaning. Barabbas is the guilty man who walks away while an innocent man dies in his place. And it was a single moment, one look, that changed everything for Cerubi. During the scene before Pilate, he was meant to make eye contact with Caviezel while the crowd screamed for crucifixion. Just a brief glance. But when it happened, something about it hit him hard. He later said in an interview, "When I looked into his eyes, I wasn't looking at an actor. There was a depth there that didn't feel human. It felt like Jesus was looking at me, and for giving me that moment stayed with him for weeks. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stop replaying that look in his mind." After filming, he moved closer to his faith, got baptized, started giving talks, and eventually wrote a book called From Barabbas to Jesus about his conversion. There were other surprises within the cast, too. Amid the lights and the murmured prayers, one actress was carrying a secret. Maya Morgenstern, who played Mary, was pregnant during filming, and almost nobody knew. Not the crew, not the makeup artists, not even Gibson himself. She later said that being pregnant gave her something impossible to fake. A quiet glow, an inner presence that showed up in every gesture and that anyone watching could sense. Part of why Gibson cast her, he later admitted, was her surname. Morgenstern means morning star in German, also one of the oldest titles given to the Virgin Mary, the star that announces light breaking through darkness. In sharp contrast to Maya's gentle presence, Rosalinda Celentano took on the most disturbing role in the film. Among all the scenes in The Passion, one stands out as especially unsettling. Jesus, doubled over from the whipping, bleeds while the crowd screams for his death. In the middle of that chaos, the camera lingers on a figure moving slowly through the crowd. A woman in black, expressionless, holding a baby. But something about that child is off. Its face looks ancient, its skin ashen, its stare unsettling enough to seem almost mocking of Christ's suffering. Gibson chose Celentano for the part of Satan because he wanted a figure that felt ambiguous, not clearly male or female, something that would unsettle audiences on a gut level. Her eyebrows were shaved, she was filmed in slow motion so she wouldn't blink, and a man's voice was layered over hers. She lost weight on a strict diet of rice and beans, transforming her natural appearance into something eerie and unnatural, a distorted reflection of divinity, corrupted at its core. The infant she carried had a wrongness that was hard to name. Almost like an old man's face grafted onto a baby, a twisted image of love turned in on itself, a corruption of something meant to be sacred. Gibson placed that image at the most violent point of the sequence, right as soldiers turned Jesus around to whip him from the front. In that exact instant, Satan appears, disguised as a mother cradling something monstrous, a dark reflection of Mary and her son, evil reveling in what it believes is heaven's defeat. Celentano later admitted the role left her emotionally wrecked. She spent weeks alone in silence just preparing to face it, and when the moment finally came, she felt like there was something genuinely real behind that darkness, a heaviness in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had turned strange. The role affected her so deeply that afterward, she stepped back from acting for a while and turned to painting instead. Meanwhile, Caviezel had slipped into a different state entirely. Many on set said he wasn't performing anymore, he'd become an extension of the role itself. His expression had changed. He barely spoke between takes, and when he did, it was almost a whisper. Some remember him staring up at the sky between scenes as if he were waiting for something. Filming eventually wrapped in the caves of Matera. The last scene shot was the resurrection. There was a charge in the air, a sense of anticipation. The cold hadn't lifted, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. Caviezel said he felt an unexplainable presence during that final take. Gibson insisted the light entering the tomb be completely natural, with nothing added digitally. Many crew members wept when they saw that light pour into the cave, others just stood frozen, unable to put what they felt into words. But everyone agreed on one thing. Somehow, God had been present. When Gibson finally called "That's a Wrap," the words landed like a release. Everyone there sensed they'd been part of something bigger than what would end up on screen. As they took down the crosses under Matera's overcast sky, crew members asked if they could keep pieces of the set as keepsakes. Gibson returned to Los Angeles fired up, hunting for a studio willing to back the project. But Hollywood at the time ran on a rigid formula. Films needed to be in English. They needed recognizable stars. They opened on Fridays with red carpets and $50 million marketing budgets. Every project had to survive test screenings and avoid anything that might offend. So when Gibson pitched a film in Aramaic and Latin opening midweek, with violence far beyond typical commercial limits, the response was a firm no across the board. Not a single studio wanted anything to do with it. They called it too violent, too religious, too risky. At least 6 major studios turned him down, worried about backlash and accusations of anti-Semitism. So Gibson did something drastic. He funded it himself. He put up $15 million of his own money and even mortgaged property to cover distribution. No studio, no traditional ad campaign, not in English, and no promise it would be entertaining in the conventional sense. By every industry rule, it shouldn't have worked. Gibson staked his reputation, his finances, and his career entirely on his own. Studio executives mocked it as Gibson's crazy Aramaic movie. What they didn't realize was that he was about to spark something that would spread around the world. Gibson began screening the film for free in churches, schools, and community halls, letting it spread by word of mouth. He arranged private screenings for thousands of pastors and Catholic leaders. Billy Graham watched it and reportedly wept, saying it felt like he'd actually been there. Rick Warren bought 18,000 tickets for his congregation alone. Then, on February 25, 2004, Ash Wednesday, The Passion of the Christ hit theaters. What followed was extraordinary. Christian communities mobilized on a massive scale. Over 10,000 churches chartered buses. Some parishes canceled services to bring their whole congregation to the movies. The numbers made no sense by normal standards. The film pulled in $26 million on opening day alone, a record for a Wednesday release. There was no red carpet, no massive ad push, yet lines wrapped around city blocks from day one looking more like pilgrimages than movie premieres. People waited with rosaries in hand and Bibles under their arms. And spontaneous prayer circles formed in parking lots. Inside the theaters, things got even stranger. Screenings started to feel like church services. Projectionists across the country described a hush falling over packed auditoriums unlike anything they'd seen before. The fact that the dialogue was in a dead language, Aramaic, somehow intensified the emotion rather than distancing viewers from it. People said they didn't need the subtitles to feel it. During the crucifixion scene, there were reports of moviegoers dropping to their knees in the aisles. At some screenings, priests offered absolution once the credits rolled. A language nobody spoke anymore had communicated something modern languages couldn't. In many cities, screenings turned into impromptu religious services, with priests leading prayers right there in the theater. People walked out in tears, quiet and shaken, as though they'd just experienced something spiritual rather than watched a movie. Conversions were reported happening in the middle of screenings. A man in Texas walked into a police station and confessed to a murder, saying the film had broken something open in him. A former convict in Florida turned himself in. In Brazil, Mexico, Poland, and the Philippines, priests said confessionals stayed full for weeks. Churches saw a surge in attendance, and pastors began preaching about the movie from the pulpit. At the same time, there were also reports of people fainting or feeling dizzy, unable to sit through the scourging scene. Then came a case that made headlines everywhere. On opening day in Wichita, Kansas, 56-year-old Peggy Law was watching the crucifixion scene when she suffered a fatal heart attack and died at the hospital shortly after. Her pastor later told reporters, "She went to see Christ die, and she died along with him." What the industry had written off as commercially doomed, audiences experienced as something profoundly true. And then the unthinkable happened. The Passion of the Christ became the highest-grossing non-English language film ever made. The numbers were staggering. It brought in over $610 million worldwide, becoming the highest-grossing R-rated film of all time and the most successful independent release ever recorded. A movie in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin with no major stars, no marketing budget, and no studio support had turned into a global phenomenon. Its success revealed something Hollywood had entirely overlooked: a massive Christian audience of over 100 million people that the industry had been ignoring for years, a spiritual hunger the industry's decision-makers simply hadn't seen. The very studios that had rejected the film as too religious and too risky now watched their own releases get overshadowed, because the whole world just wanted to see this story. Gibson had risked everything he had, and against all odds he'd won. But that victory would soon become his worst nightmare. Hollywood turned on him with a fierce backlash. Critics tore the film apart. Accusations of anti-Semitism, extremism, and glorified violence filled the press. The film was banned in Malaysia and Israel. Major outlets like the New York Times and The Guardian led the charge, claiming the film revived old prejudices and calling Gibson a religious extremist. The backlash got so intense that, trying to calm things down, Gibson made a last-minute edit. He removed the subtitle translation of Matthew 27:25, the line where the crowd says Christ's blood should be on them and their children. The actor still spoke the line in Aramaic, but no English text appeared. Even so, it wasn't enough to stop the criticism. Anti-Semitism accusations dominated headlines for weeks, with journalists and scholars debating whether Gibson had placed blame on the Jewish people for Christ's death. Some called for the film to be censored, others called for deeper analysis. Meanwhile, audiences just kept showing up. Every wave of criticism seemed to draw more curiosity, not less. Years later, in various interviews, Gibson explained his thinking. Christ's suffering wasn't a metaphor. It was real. I didn't want something pretty or theatrical. I wanted people to feel the actual weight of sin on a human body. He said that any time he considered softening a scene during filming, something told him not to, because in that moment the pain wasn't just Christ's. It belonged to everyone. He always maintained the violence wasn't gratuitous, it came from reverence, not shock value. Sometimes truth is painful. But if Christ went through that out of love, the least I could do was show it honestly. When it came to the anti-Semitism accusations, his response was calm but direct. Jesus was Jewish. His mother was Jewish. His apostles were Jewish. How could I possibly hate his own people? I wasn't filming hatred, I was filming redemption. And on Hollywood's reaction, he was even more blunt. They didn't reject this film because they misunderstood the message. They rejected it because they understood it perfectly. Asked years later whether it had all been worth it, Gibson didn't hesitate. Yes, I'd do it exactly the same way again. Because of what it did in people, I saw hearts change. That's worth more than any award. In a later conversation, he admitted, after the premiere, it felt like everything was collapsing around me, like something invisible had decided to come after me. Following the wave of criticism, Gibson withdrew almost entirely. He avoided interviews for months and public appearances dropped off completely. While the film sparked debate across the world, he retreated into silence, turning his ranch in Costa Rica into something of a hideout. The pressure left him irritable, paranoid, and worn down. The same faith that had gotten him through filming now seemed to be putting him through a different kind of trial. His personal life started to unravel. Old struggles with alcohol, anger, and guilt resurfaced with a vengeance. Alcohol had haunted him since he was young. He'd spent much of his life trying not to repeat his father Hutton Gibson's own struggles with drinking. The paparazzi trailed him constantly, waiting for him to slip, and eventually, he did. 2 years after the premiere, in 2006, Gibson was arrested in Malibu while drunk. In a burst of rage, he shouted that Jewish people were behind every war in history. The footage spread instantly, and just a few seconds of audio undid decades of career building. That single outburst became a media death sentence. Mugshots circulated everywhere, and Hollywood effectively blacklisted him. He later described it as the lowest point of his life, calling it not a stumble, but a public execution. The director behind Braveheart, an Oscar winner, had become an industry outcast almost overnight. Friends stopped calling. So did everyone else. In later interviews, he confessed there were moments he thought about dying. He felt betrayed, ashamed, and completely lost. After the Passion, everything went dark, like I'd woken up something I didn't know was inside me. For years, he stayed out of the public eye entirely. No interviews, no work, no ceremonies. His 28-year marriage to Robin ended in 2009. He isolated himself, dealt with lawsuits and rehab, and went through a deep personal reckoning. Waking up every day feeling like the whole world hates you, that's a weight I wouldn't wish on anyone, he later said. But somewhere in that darkness, Gibson found a new reason to keep going, a sequel to The Passion of the Christ. We'll get to that shortly. First, though, it's worth looking at what happened to Jim Caviezel, the man who played Jesus, because for him, the cost of that role was enormous. He said openly that playing Christ effectively ended his career in Hollywood. In the early 2000s, Caviezel had everything a studio could want. Tall, magnetic, calm-voiced, with an intensity that reminded people of Gregory Peck mixed with Tom Cruise's screen presence. He'd already proven himself in major films like The Thin Red Line, Frequency, and The Count of Monte Cristo. Magazines listed him among the most promising actors of his generation, and top directors wanted to work with him. His future looked completely secure. Then The Passion premiered, and the calls stopped coming. Scripts dried up, projects disappeared. The film made him instantly recognizable worldwide. His blood-streaked, dust-covered face became iconic, but within the industry, he'd become someone people didn't quite know what to do with. At a conference in 2011, he addressed it directly. They told me my career was finished. And honestly, they were right. But if I had it to do over, I'd do it again without hesitating. Studios simply didn't want to hire the Catholic Jesus. He was branded difficult, fanatical, a liability. For years, he survived on small supporting roles and quiet TV work. Instead of trying to distance himself from the role that had cost him so much, he leaned further into it. He started traveling and speaking about faith, suffering, and hope. The industry froze him out almost entirely, his agent dropped him, the media mocked his religious comments, and he received hostile messages and even threats over his outspoken Christianity. Still, he didn't back down. He found stability in his family and his faith, and he and his wife adopted 3 children with disabilities from China, raising them away from public attention. I went from being one of the most in-demand actors around to not getting a single phone call, he said later. I didn't do anything wrong. I just played Jesus. Rather than growing bitter, he grew steadier, speaking in churches, taking roles in faith-based films, volunteering in prisons and hospitals, and sharing his story at retreats. Then, in 2011, things began to change. After nearly 10 years out of the spotlight, he got an unexpected offer and was cast as the lead in Person of Interest, which ran for 5 seasons. But his real comeback came almost 20 years later. In 2023, he starred in Sound of Freedom, an independent film based on a former federal agent's fight against child trafficking. Major studios wouldn't distribute it, so Christian communities spread the word themselves, and social media carried it the rest of the way. It quietly became a phenomenon, ultimately earning over $250 million worldwide, outperforming releases from Disney and Warner. Caviezel was suddenly back in headlines, once again with a project Hollywood had passed on that ended up succeeding against every expectation. God gave me another chance, he said. When the world closed its doors on me, he opened a much bigger one. As Caviezel found his way back into the spotlight, Gibson was on the rise too. After years of silence, isolation, and personal struggle, his focus returned once again to the place where it all began, the empty tomb. Gibson never saw The Passion as a finished story. He'd always imagined it as the opening chapter of something much bigger. a story that doesn't end at the cross, but in triumph over death. For 20 years, we've talked about the passion of the Christ as though it were the whole story. But it's becoming clear the other half was always missing, the victory. The passion showed us the cost, the suffering, we watched it, and it shook us. The film ended at the tomb, with a promise still hanging in the air. But a promise isn't the ending, it's the setup for what comes next. With the resurrection of the Christ, Gibson isn't just making another biblical film. He's closing a loop he opened 20 years ago, turning that story of suffering into the beginning of something much larger. Seen together, these aren't two separate movies, they're one story in three parts. First, death. Crucifixion. Confusion. Second, the descent. The unseen struggle. The underworld. Third, the rise, the appearances, the mission, the hope. Before long, people probably won't talk about the Passion and the Resurrection as separate films. They'll talk about the Christ diptych, 6 hours of film covering the entire arc, the greatest mystery in Christian belief, the full story from the cross and the tomb to victory over death, told as one complete journey. For 7 years, Gibson worked quietly on the script alongside his brother Donal and Braveheart writer Randall Wallace, crafting something he's called an almost otherworldly experience, something no one has ever seen put on film before. In a recent interview, he summed it up in one unsettling line: "It's going to feel like a mystical journey, a descent and then an ascent." Because the resurrection of the Christ isn't just going to show Jesus rising from the dead. Gibson doesn't want to stop at that single moment. He wants to explore what happened in between, from Friday to Sunday, while Christ's body lay in the tomb. And here's the part worth paying attention to. Gibson has said he's including something never shown on the big screen before. Christ's descent into Hades, the moment he breaks open the gates of hell to free souls who'd been waiting for that promise. It's there that the Son of God confronts death itself and claims final victory over it. Gibson has said he's not trying to recreate the same physical brutality as the first film, but instead capture the unseen force of redemption. Where the Passion showed a body broken, the resurrection will show a soul triumphant. The goal isn't to retell the same story, it's to go deeper into the mystery that changed everything. The third day. Gibson has said he's not aiming to make a religious film, he wants to create a spiritual experience, one that pushes viewers to confront their own faith the way the first film forced them to confront guilt. In an interview with Stephen Colbert, he said, "This will be the greatest event in human history." Everyone understands suffering, but very few grasp the magnitude of what happened after the cross. Christ didn't just come back to life, he defeated death itself. The project has been kept under tight wraps, but Caviezel has said, "This is going to be the biggest film ever made, 5 times bigger than The Passion." Gibson originally planned to start filming after the pandemic, but his perfectionism has pushed the timeline back repeatedly. He's revisited the same locations in Matera used for The Passion to rebuild first-century Jerusalem with even more historical precision. And he's consulted theologians, historians, and biblical scholars to accurately portray the timeline between the crucifixion and resurrection. The film will show the apostles' confusion, Mary's quiet grief, the Roman guards' bewilderment, spiritual darkness, and finally, a light that never fades. Gibson describes it as a journey from the horror of death into an eternal dawn. But he's hinted at one more surprise. At a private event in 2023, he suggested the resurrection will include a sequence unlike anything audiences have seen, inspired by the Book of Revelation. Could that mean he's also planning to eventually bring Revelation to the screen, showing a glorified Christ, King of Kings? There's no official confirmation of that yet, but the hint is out there. It could end up being an unforgettable moment, the first cinematic glimpse of what many believe is still to come, the second coming of Christ. Consider this for a moment. Over 2 billion people build their entire faith and hope for eternity around a single event, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And yet, in the most widely read book in history, that moment itself is never described. Not one gospel details the exact instant life returned to that body. Scripture jumps straight from the cross to the empty tomb. It's the event that changed everything, and for 2,000 years, no one actually witnessed how it happened. For more than a century of filmmaking, no director had attempted to fill that gap, until now. There's something almost ironic about the fact that Mel Gibson, a man whose public downfall was largely self-inflicted, may be the only director willing and able to bring this most sacred of stories to the screen. It's a strange contradiction. But when you look at the whole arc of his story, it starts to make sense. God didn't pick the flawless messenger. He picked the broken one, an imperfect man carrying a message meant to be perfect. And here's the news that surprised everyone: the resurrection of the Christ won't be a single movie. It'll be two. The first releases on Good Friday 2027, and the second exactly 40 days later on Ascension Day, the day Jesus is said to have ascended into heaven. Why split it into two parts? Because in the gap between the releases, something unusual is planned to unfold in theaters worldwide. According to Gibson, this is meant to be experienced in real time, not just watched. Like the disciples 2,000 years ago, audiences will live through the 40 days between resurrection and ascension. He's calling on believers everywhere to relive that pivotal stretch of history alongside the film. The Passion showed us how Jesus died. The resurrection will show us why that death mattered. Forever, this is meant to be the final chapter of what's often called the greatest story ever told. For years, there were rumors Caviezel would return as Jesus, and he even said as much in interviews. But in 2025, Gibson made a surprising call. He wouldn't be bringing back the original cast. He said the decision was both artistic and symbolic, since he believes every generation should encounter the face of Christ freshly. The lead role now belongs to Finnish actor Jaakko Otonen, with Mariella Garriga playing Mary Magdalene, Kasia Smutniak as the Virgin Mary, Pierluigi Pacino as Peter, and Riccardo Scamarcio as Pontius Pilate. The budget has climbed past $100 million, more than double what The Passion cost. But the bigger challenge here isn't financial, it's theological and visual. How do you depict the afterlife? Gibson's team is working with theologians, historians, and visual artists to render the spiritual space between death and resurrection, where darkness attempts to hold back the light and Christ breaks death's hold. Producers say Gibson is blending apocryphal tradition with biblical scholarship, exploring the moment the Messiah's soul descends into hell to free the righteous. Gibson has said he isn't out to provoke, he's trying to reveal something. He wants people to understand that the resurrection isn't a tidy, happy conclusion, but the start of an unseen struggle. In his own words, the Passion was about suffering. The resurrection is going to be about power. The tone will be different. Less bloodshed, more mystery, less visible pain, more spiritual conflict, exploring heaven and hell, time and eternity. Gibson has been clear he's not trying to compete with Hollywood, he's answering it. While the industry spends hundreds of millions on fictional heroes, he wants to tell the story of the one figure who actually defeated death, backing it with the same conviction that led him to self-fund The Passion when no one else believed in it. I don't just want to show that Christ came back to life, I want to show why, not for his own sake, but for ours. In one of his more recent statements, Gibson distilled the whole project into a single sentence. The Passion showed how much Christ loved us. The resurrection is going to show how far that love actually went. After the massive success of The Passion of the Christ, Hollywood suddenly started paying attention to an audience it had long overlooked: believers. Studies at the time found that around 10% of viewers said the film had changed something about their beliefs or religious practices, and 18% said they'd started praying more or attending church more often. A wave of faith-based films followed: God's Not Dead, Heaven is for Real, Letters to God, War Room, Miracles from Heaven, but none matched the original's impact. The Passion stayed the standard nobody could quite reach. In the years since, Hollywood learned that faith-driven audiences could fill theaters, but that appeal couldn't be manufactured on demand. These audiences were discerning. They weren't looking for polished sermons or neatly tied endings. They wanted something that felt true. Plenty tried to recreate that success, but none quite managed it. The film was banned in several Muslim-majority countries and criticized in parts of Europe for its intensity, but that only added to its mystique. Where the industry saw a commercial anomaly, audiences experienced something closer to the supernatural. Theologians and psychologists have studied the film's impact for years. And there's a fairly consistent conclusion. The Passion triggered a kind of shared emotional and spiritual release that extended well beyond the theater. Millions of people worldwide have described it as a turning point in their lives. Some call it a kind of spiritual jolt that reawakens people to ideas of suffering and redemption, but something beyond that also happened. Hundreds of people across different countries, ages, and backgrounds reported experiences while watching the film that they couldn't easily explain. Healings, vivid dreams, sudden conversions, reconciled families, and what many described as a kind of spiritual release. Some said they sensed a presence in the room, an unexplainable warmth. Others described feeling a peace they'd never known. During the crucifixion scene, some said they felt a physical weight on their chest that suddenly lifted, as if something inside them had broken free. Many wept for hours without understanding exactly why. For a lot of people, it felt like a genuine encounter, a specific moment when something dormant inside them was finally touched. Across forums, books, and recorded testimonies, people have shared remarkable stories. A woman in Argentina said her eyesight partially improved after watching the film and praying in front of the screen. A man in the Philippines said he felt God speak to him directly during the scourging scene. A young man in Italy struggling with addiction said he broke free from it the same night he watched the movie. In Brazil, a priest described a screening where members of the audience spontaneously began confessing their sins in tears. If this film ever affected you the same way, or sparked something similar in your own life, share it in the comments below. What happened? What you felt? What shifted inside you? What you went through may not have been just an emotional reaction. It could have been a real moment of connection, a point where something that had been dormant in you for years finally stirred. Thousands of people around the world have said something changed in them after watching this film. Some found peace after years of pain. Others felt forgiveness they'd never even asked for. Some simply realized, maybe for the first time, that they weren't as alone as they thought. Every story you share has the potential to reach someone else, so don't hesitate to put yours out there. Faith spreads when people talk about it. For millions of believers, The Passion went beyond being just a film and became a genuine experience of faith. If you'd like more content like this, consider subscribing to this channel. Every week we put out videos meant to strengthen your faith, deepen your understanding of Scripture, and uncover the hidden layers of meaning within the Bible for those willing to look closer. And if you want to understand how deeply this story is woven into real history, there's another video worth watching right now. It covers 10 objects Jesus is believed to have touched that still exist today. If all you know is the story of the Passion, you're only seeing part of the picture. Once you see the physical traces he left behind in history, your understanding of the story becomes something much more tangible. In times like these, belief without understanding isn't quite enough anymore. This is the piece that helps complete the picture of Jesus' imprint on the world. Click through and take a look. You won't want to miss it.